ISHR students, we are here with our next video lecture in our video lecture series, and this one is on theory of the firm. We're looking at the market structure for a monopoly firm. Let's get right into it. Let's look at our learning goals. One, we'll need to know the assumptions of the model, the sort of factors that usually make up a monopoly market structure. We'll look at the different types of monopolies that exist in the world, and that's not really an IB standard, but still it's important to understand the differences because there are different types of monopolies. We want you to create a monopoly diagram, there's a typical monopoly diagram. There's also something called a natural monopoly, and we'll also want to create a monopoly diagram that has the consumer and producer surplus. We'll also look at the strengths and weaknesses and solutions to correct a monopoly. All right, so with a monopoly, assumptions of the model, let's talk about it. You probably know this already. How many number of firms in the market structure of a monopoly? Well, we usually say it's one firm. You could also sort of add to that definition. It is typically one firm, or it is one firm that dominates or has at least 80% market share. In German, we call this Marktanteile. Or more. So again, if one firm controls at least 80% of the market, it's said to be a monopoly. So next, generally the barriers to entry are high or even impossibly high. It's very hard for other firms to enter into this market structure. The price setting power of monopoly, as they are usually the only competitor in an industry, is very, very high. There's no non-price competition because there's nobody to compete with. You don't see monopolies ever making advertisements, or generally not making advertisements, because they don't need to, because they're the only one that makes the good or service that they do. A good example of a monopoly would be De Beers, which was a diamond industry. Also Luxottica, which makes a lot of different eyeglasses frames around the world. Also energy companies such as trying to think of a good example, like local energy companies, utility companies, sewage companies in your neighborhood or city. Also, there are a lot of medical companies that, like the one that Mylan that produces the EpiPen. They've got a monopoly on that specific type of medicine or that specific way of injecting medicine. Okay, so these are the assumptions of the model. Please write these down. Let's go on to the types of monopolies. So there's something called a natural monopoly. And generally, we want you to write two things down about this. One, that it's a monopoly that has very, very high fixed costs. When we think about, for example, a telephone company, the cost of building all of the different telephone poles and hanging wires from those telephone poles is very, very expensive. So they have very high fixed costs. Also, for IB, they want you to note that a natural monopoly is somewhat said to exist when a single firm can produce at a lower average total cost than two or more smaller firms. So generally, because those fixed costs are so high, one really large firm generally has lower operating costs or lower average total costs than two or more smaller firms. That's a natural monopoly. A good example would be like a telephone company. Next, we have technological monopolies. This occurs when somebody has, or a firm rather, has specific rights, exclusive rights to an idea, design, product. These are things like patents or copyrights. The best example of these types of monopolies are medicines, right? So if somebody invents a medicine, then they have a monopoly on the production of that specific medicine, usually for at least 20 years. Next, we have a government monopoly. This is where the government limits competition. These are, it could be on a state level, a local level, or even a national level. These are things like water companies or sewage companies, could even be like trash collection. The government sometimes limits competition and regulates it heavily, and these would be government monopolies. Again, good examples would be water companies. Next, last but not least, a geographic monopoly. It's basically when a single firm provides the only good or service within a designated area. A good example of this type of monopoly would be, for example, if you're ever driving, in the middle of nowhere and there's like a gas station. in the middle of nowhere, and like maybe you're driving between two cities in a desert, and there's a gas station in the middle of that desert. That would be kind of a geographic monopoly. And usually you only see one little gas station between, maybe in a desert between two big cities, because that's, the market would only support one gas station, and they'd be the only one that wants to put up their shop there or live there to provide that service. So there's also a geographic monopoly. Okay, let's look at the example of how a monopoly typically looks in terms of the costs and revenues. Down here I've neglected to put output, but I will definitely remedy that in the video once it's uploaded. Here we've got the marginal cost curve, we've got the party curve, or the price, average revenue, demand curve. Remember that marginal revenue is always twice as steep as average revenue for a monopoly. And this is the diagram for a monopoly. Please go ahead and copy that down. You can pause the video and then unpause it when you're done drawing it. Okay, you've got it. So here we've got our monopoly diagram, and there's a few things to note here. When we look at where the monopoly is going to produce, we know they're going to produce where MC equals MR. Well, those two points, those two lines intersect right there. So they're going to produce that quantity. That's the most profitable quantity for them. Next, what is the price going to be? Well, along this curve, where if we were to keep drawing that line up, it would intersect right there, and that's going to be our price. So we could write P here, or we could also just note that this is going to be the price. And so here we've got our price and our average revenue. Here, if we look at our average cost curve, if we look at different amounts of output at different costs at this level of quantity, this is our cost. So this represents if cost is lower than revenue, this box must be profit. Oops, I thought there was a little thing that was going to pop up. I made this a couple days ago. I forgot to put that in, but this is our profit box. So please note that monopolies tend to earn abnormal profit. Ideally, we should be at a point where MC, or supply, kind of equals demand. We should be here, but monopolies don't like to offer their goods and services usually at the market price. They usually raise the price and lower the quantity, so we've got a price that's up and a quantity that's lower. Let's talk a little bit more about monopoly. As we mentioned a moment ago, monopolies tend to earn abnormal profit in the short and long run. This monopoly is earning a lot lower profit, but it's still earning abnormal profit. This is probably true because they can keep out competition. Nobody comes in and forces them to lower their prices. Often most monopolies basically limit quantity and create artificial scarcity and then try to drive up their prices. As you can probably imagine, the consumer surplus is usually less than the producer surplus. So just kind of something to note. There's our consumer surplus. There's our producer surplus. So you can clearly see that producer surplus is a lot bigger. If we were here, where we should be, then it would be equal, but we're not there. This triangle, which, sorry, it wouldn't line up quite perfectly, this is our deadweight loss, or sometimes called a welfare loss. Go ahead and make this diagram too, and please note that a monopoly is also kind of thought of as a market failure. Monopoly is thought of as a market failure. Okay, moving on. There's also something called a natural monopoly. A little while ago we told you that monopolies generally, natural monopolies is one where their fixed costs are very high. The cost of all the infrastructure, the telephone poles and the telephone lines and all of the technology is very, very expensive. And we said that one firm usually has lower costs or average total cost than two or more smaller firms. You could create a diagram like this, kind of like a economies of scale diagram. And here with this diagram we have we can see this is our short run average costs, and we would call this of two or more smaller firms. and here's our short-run average costs of one single firm. So we can clearly see that the costs of the single firm are lower and the output is greater than the cost and output of two or more smaller firms. So please note, I mean, you could even write that right here, that this is one firm and this is two or more smaller firms, and that we can clearly see that the average costs are lower for the single firm. This is a natural monopoly diagram. All right, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses, and we'll go pretty quickly. Monopolies tend to, one of the strengths is that they earn abnormal profit, usually in the short and the long run. As they do earn abnormal profit, this enables them to do a lot of R&D, or research and development. Monopolies also tend to be larger businesses, and they will benefit from economies of scale in a lot of different ways. So as a very large industry or business that has a lot of output, they'll probably benefit from financial economies of scale and managerial economies of scale, and they generally will have a very high output at very low costs, which is good. Finally, one last strength, not all monopolies are bad. Things like geographic monopolies provide goods and services that might not normally, that actually benefit the market, and can support, the market can actually support things like what we said earlier, like gas stations in the desert, and people do need gas in the desert. So geographic monopolies aren't necessarily, necessarily impacting the market negatively. I mean, yes, they probably have high prices as they're in the middle of a desert, and they have high transportation costs, but consumers will go and buy those goods and services because they're available, and maybe they need gas or maybe they need water while they're driving through. Okay, weaknesses. Well, as we said, reduced consumer surplus. Next, that monopolies generally manipulate markets for their own benefit. They will reduce the quantity, increase the price, and increase their profits because it benefits them. Often monopolies, and this is kind of sad, do not invest in research and development. They don't need to, because if they've got a monopoly and no competition, then they can basically take all of that money that they could invest in research and development and just plow it back into dividends for shareholders, or big bonuses for the CEO. I mean, often we hope that they do R&D, but they don't always. Many monopolies, sadly, do what's called rent-seeking behavior. Rent-seeking behavior is when a firm usually seeks to increase its income without increasing or creating any new wealth or any new goods and services. Meaning, so they'll try to lobby the government to give them some sort of beneficial law or beneficial treatment that only helps them make more money and doesn't do anything else for anyone else in society. Again, this is really depressing, but it happens all the time where large industries use money to lobby whoever's in charge of, well, not who's in charge, but legislative, governmental bodies. So whether that's the House of Commons or Congress in the United States, companies are giving large amounts of money to different political interests to create laws that benefit only them and often hurt consumers. Finally, a monopoly is a market failure. We are not at the allocatively efficient price or quantity. We're at a much higher price and a much lower quantity. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we could correct this. One way we could correct this is what's called antitrust legislation. So antitrust legislation kind of refers to, it's a term that came out at about 115 years ago. They used to call companies trusts, and we had a few companies that got very, very large. And so antitrust legislation, where there's this sort of government initiative in the United States to break up the trusts or to impact the trusts that were abusing the market. One example of antitrust legislation, how we can limit the power of monopoly, we can break them up into smaller companies. In the United States, AT&T used to dominate the telephone industry in the United States, and it was broken up into a whole bunch of smaller companies that would then compete with each other. The idea was that the competition would be good for the market and stop AT&T from gouging or really raising the prices. Telmex in Mexico is owned by Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest men in the world, and the Mexican government was actually going to come down upon his business, and he tried to stop them by breaking up his companies because he knew that that's what they were probably going to do anyways. So he tried to break it up into smaller companies. We'll talk a little bit more about that in class. But yeah, that's one method. You can break up the companies into a bunch of small companies, and then they compete. Also, you can fine companies. Google in Europe was fined for manipulating advertising prices, as they were the dominant producer of advertising space on the internet, and the EU found them guilty, and so they, gave them a big fine. We can also do a price ceiling, and the one that we're going to want to do is what's called a fair return price ceiling. It's where we take a price ceiling and we're going to force it down. Like normally, we know that they would want to be where MC equals MR, which would be way up here. But then, and they're earning a lot of abnormal profit. But then, the government might say, hey, you're earning all this abnormal profit. You've got really high prices. We're going to put a ceiling so that the price can't go up beyond that point. A fair return is going to be where ATC intersects with AR. So if they put it right here, at this point right here, AC is equal to AR, meaning that average revenue is equal to average cost. And if average revenue is equal to average cost, then total revenue is going to be equal to total cost. And the monopoly will be earning, guess what? Normal profit. Okay, so that's the fair return price, and that might be another way that we could stop the monopoly from jacking up prices. Finally, and this doesn't happen as much, we could do what's called fair market. Fair return, they're making normal profit. Fair market is where basically MC, or supply, equals demand, or AR. And that's going to be right there. And what you might notice about this price, the fair market price, it's even lower. And you probably notice that at that point, AR is lower than AC. That may cause the monopoly to lose some money, which would be very, they might have to shut down. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. I want to give you a few real-world examples, and we'll talk about these real quick. The classic examples of monopoly in the United States were Standard Oil and U.S. Steel, run by Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie. And these men owned businesses that dominated these industries. Controlled basically the entire market. And they, in some cases, really jacked up prices and behaved poorly. And that's where that whole antitrust legislation term comes from. Another thing that, another good example would be, some people say Google is kind of a monopoly, as they, kind of dominate the ad space market in the internet. If anybody wants to advertise their business on the internet, Google will be the, overwhelmingly popular choice, and they dominate this market. And they got a fine in Europe, and for abusing their prices. Also, another great, it's not great, it's kind of terrible, but modern world example of monopolies are pharmaceutical companies. You have different companies like GlaxoSmithKline, Valeant, AstraZeneca, Turing, and Mylan. Mylan makes the EpiPen. Turing is the one that this guy, Martin Shkreli, he was the CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals, and he and his team were responsible for taking this drug for toxoplasmosis and jacking up the price from $750 to something like, $750 for one pill. His justification was that by raising the price, it'll enable them to do a lot of research and development on new drugs, which was a bunch of baloney. I don't think they ever intended to do that research and development. They just said that they wanted to do it. So please note that a lot of these companies, these pharmaceutical companies, are behaving very poorly. They are technological monopolies. They have monopolies on certain drugs, and this is really depressing. A lot of them have been earning a lot of money from the sale of these drugs, but they aren't using the money to fund new drug research because new drug research is very, very expensive. So what a lot of these companies have been doing is merging. Like they buy their competitors, and when they do, their stock price tends to go up, and then the people that make up the board of shareholders make a lot of money in the short run. So they're, big into, hey, let's not invest in new drugs, let's buy another company, and then we'll have a, bigger share of the market, and our share price will go up. So they don't use the money to develop new medicines, or, the other thing they could do is purchase patents. They buy patents from other companies, or just from other people that come up with these patents, and they don't actually invest in doing their own research. It's depressing. Also, this is true as well. Many of the companies now are just using their existing drugs, and they're not researching new ones. And what they'll do is they will, for example, they'll go back and look over the research for their old medicines that they've created and find new uses. So like Botox, which used to be injected in people's foreheads so they wouldn't have as much wrinkle in their forehead, is now a headache medicine. Wellbutrin, which was an antidepressant, they found that Wellbutrin also helps people to quit smoking. So the pharmaceutical company that owns that put another name on it and then remarketed it as a stop smoking drug. So they're not really making new drugs, they're just finding new uses for existing drugs and saying it treats this and that. Also, a lot of these firms, like Allergan, which is another pharmaceutical company, recently relocated their corporate headquarters or corporate HQ to Dublin. They did this because the corporate tax rates in Ireland are very, very low. So they'll just move to wherever they can have, their profits will be taxed at the least amount, but still try to sell things, everywhere in the world to maximize their profits. They have no commitment to the people that they serve. They're just going to try to minimize costs any way they can and maximize revenue and profits. Another thing, too, that I didn't mention to you, but a lot of these companies also have been firing a lot of their researchers and scientists because in the short run, when you fire these people or get rid of these research teams, your costs drop. And so it looks like when you look at your balance sheet, like, oh, we're making a lot of money. Our costs have dropped, but our revenue's the same. We're making more money. And so, but the thing is, they're not inventing any new drugs. It's terrible. So again, this is just an example of cost cutting to maximize the returns for shareholders. Again, these companies are controlled by the people that own the stock. The people that own the stock only want big dividends, and they don't care how they get it. So do you move to a new country with lower taxes, merge with another company, whatever you have to do to get the price of the stock up and the dividends higher. And this is something that's just happening all across the world in terms of with a lot of these different drug companies, whether they're American or European or even a few other places in the world. Okay, so those are some problems with monopoly.